Hello, everybody. Welcome. We'll get started in just a minute. While we're waiting for everyone to join, if you want to put in the chat box where you're joining us from, that would be great. Hi, Christina. Good to see you. All right. Well, I am going to go ahead and get started and honor everybody's time because we have a lot to get through today. So first of all, welcome. I am Kim Klett. I'm the Deputy Executive Director for the Educators Institute for Human Rights. Founded by teachers for teachers, EIHR supports communities recovering from violent conflict. We do this by applying lessons from the Holocaust and other egregious violations of human rights, such as the Rwanda genocide, as a starting point for teaching secondary students about how these conflicts evolve and how to prevent them. Please learn more about our work at eihr.org. I would like to begin today with a land acknowledgement. At EIHR, we hope to inspire action in supporting our Indigenous communities. We recognize our native lands in gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on, and honor the Indigenous people who have been living and working on this land from time immemorial. I am in Gilbert, Arizona, on the land of the O'odham, and our office on K Street in Washington, D.C. is on the land of the Piscataway. If you are joining us here in the US and would like to see on whose land you reside, we'll put the link in the chat box so you can find that information. Today's webinar with Fareed Mustoufi is one of a series focused on issues around the human rights of children and issues that affect children today. We hope you can join us December 5th when we will continue learning about the Yazidis with Abed and Olivia from Nadia's initiative. That webinar will focus on the book, The Last Girl, by Nobel Peace Prize recipient Nadia Murad. We hope you can read the book and join us for what promises to be an interesting conversation. And even if you don't read the book, we hope you'll join us. And we'll put that link in the chat box for you as well. For today's program, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to them following each of the speakers' sections. And with that, please welcome Fareed, who is with the Pulitzer Center and the 1619 Project. And Fareed, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Kim and Kate, and this amazing organization doing truly invaluable work. I'm so excited to support today, and also very excited about these upcoming events you've shared, and to join as a participant and learn from those as well. So my name is Fareed Mustoufi. I use he, him pronouns, and I am joining today from Washington, D.C. I want to acknowledge that that is the traditional territory of the Piscataway, and really appreciate the resource that I hope we can all look at to learn more about how we can acknowledge the land that we are on. I'm joining from the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, an organization that has supported and continues to support the educational outreach connected to the 1619 Project. But hearing about some of the work that you all are doing, I think we might also be able to support with many of our other resources, which is why as we go through the presentation today, I'm going to start with sharing a little bit about the Pulitzer Center, our mission and resources for educators and the public, and then to move into speaking a little bit more specifically about the work with the 1619 project. It's been a really exciting week for the project. 2 new books launched this week, and I'll tell you a little bit about those, as well as the history of the project, which launched over 2 years ago. So I'm hoping that we can interact today using the Q&A function and also the chat feature. I often have to remind myself that when I'm in the chat, the way to make sure everyone sees what I'm saying is by changing that little blue box above where you're typing to everyone. That's a way that we can share with our colleagues here. You can also just send a message directly to us by changing that filter to hosts and panelists. So just to get us started there, for those who haven't already, please join the chat, share where you're based today. And then also, if you'd like to add a word to describe how you're doing, it'd be great to just get a temperature check on where we're at today. So feel free to add that to the chat. So excited to see folks from Pennsylvania, the Washington area, Arizona, New Jersey. I would say the word to describe how I'm doing today is excited. So excited to hear what yours are. Sneaking back here a little bit, our goals for today are to, in addition to looking at the Pulitzer Center's mission and resources that might support your work as part of this organization and in classrooms, we're going to look specifically at resources from the 1619 project. And our hope is to leave today understanding the mission of that project and the resources that are a part of it. Additionally, we're going to look at some curricular resources that already exist to introduce some ways to connect that project to your students. And also hopefully have some time for you to do exploring not only of the resources from the project itself, but also some of those curricular resources and to ask questions. The final thing that I'm hoping we can do today more generally is to explore and evaluate how authentic engagement with underreported news stories on racial justice as part of the 1619 project, but also media literacy skills, the critical thinking skills that we apply when closely analyzing texts in this project and all that we engage in, how they can help our students and us engage curiously, critically, and empathetically with the world. So that's how we've structured the presentation today, but I also know it's a Sunday. It is a remarkable year in classrooms. I know there have been some additional challenges, news this week and month and year that I know are putting stress on classrooms and on teachers. So number one goal today is to take care of ourselves and each other. So connecting in the chat, asking questions. Also, I know I can't see you all, but I hope you're sitting comfortably, that you're feel free to, get water at any time and participate in the way that feels active and makes sense for you. So speaking of that, taking a look in the chat today, I'm seeing we have some more folks joining from Italy, from North Carolina. Excellent. Many of us using the resource that you shared to learn a little bit more about the history of our land. Thank you for that. So this slideshow will be provided to everyone at the end of the session. It includes some guiding questions. And these are the questions that we'll explore today. So I'll just hold those on the screen for a moment for everyone to take a look. All right, kind of echoing our goals there. So this is our schedule, a mix of looking at content, looking at curricular resources, but please help, and our colleagues who are hosting today are going to help hold us to time for questions as well. So please share questions throughout. I'm happy to pause for those, but I'll make sure to leave some time at the end as well, and for ideas. So I'll start with a little bit about the Pulitzer Center. We're a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. That aims to, our office is based in Washington, D.C., but with staff all over the world and throughout the United States. And our mission is to raise awareness of underreported global issues in 2 ways. One is through direct support of how we identify quality journalism across all media platforms. And I'll talk more about what that means to our organization. And also a unique program of education and public outreach. So this is a screenshot of our website where you see all of that: journalism, education, resources. And we're going to look at pieces of those because maybe there's some of these resources that might support your students as well. When I say that quality journalism exploring underreported global issues, what we're pointing to is, and what we talk when we talk to students, we talk to them about underreported stories. What does that mean? And how does that compare to the news stories that students and many of us are used to seeing when we're passively engaging with content in the ways that we look for news? Well, to help answer that question, we worked with two of our editors and several of the journalists who've worked with us over the years to create this video to explain what an underreported story is. So I'm going to share that with you now, and then please let me know in the chat if you have any other questions about what we mean by that term.
Hi, I'm Steve Sapienza.
And I'm Nora Moraga Louie. We're members of the editorial team at the Pulitzer Center.
And we're here to talk and how you find them.
An underreported story covers an issue that is important, but isn't getting the attention it deserves.
These can be stories that aren't necessarily in the breaking news headlines, or they're covered, but missing critical perspectives and nuance.
Underreported stories, they're underreported for reasons. It usually has to do with our agenda setting.
It's driven by clicks and news cycles around things like disasters and elections. Of course, that doesn't tell the whole story about the world.
These are stories that can save lives. For example, we now know that there was far less coverage of the coronavirus issue in the first weeks of 2020 than we should have had, given what epidemiologists knew at the time. The last time there was a pandemic, in 1918, the same thing happened. The flu claimed millions of lives, but the virus barely made the front page because most news coverage focused on World War I.
Underreported stories raise awareness about issues we know little about. Reading them makes you a smarter citizen, better able to make informed decisions and useful contributions to society.
They also illuminate the deeper issues that we face as a society. They help us build empathy, expose corruption, hold the powerful accountable, find solutions to difficult problems, and affect change.
And the video goes on to describe some examples, but I've also pulled some that we can look at based on the context of the organization that's hosting us today, which I know we're focusing on the human rights of children this year. So I've pulled some examples for you. Let me know in the chat if you have any other questions about what we mean. I know something that I try to emphasize when I talk about process this video with students is highlighting how what the editors say about how these stories look at the challenges that we face by focusing on causes, looking at history, looking at context for some of the things that we might be seeing in our communities and in the world. Also examining which voices are being heard, which voices aren't, and who is accountable for some of the issues that we're seeing, and also who is most deeply impacted and are they getting a voice. So that's often what our editors are looking for in these stories. And the way that it works is that actually the journalists who report the stories that we support, they are actually reaching out to for support on stories that have already been discussed and evaluated in partnership with editors at news outlets, with editorial teams, fact checkers, and they're reaching out to us for the support for reporting costs that might limit the ability to do this story. So travel costs, time to for translation, for extensive research, time to be in a location for building relationships. So these stories, once they are completed using grants that these journalists receive from the Pulitzer Center, some of whom, by the way, those journalists might be freelance reporting for multiple publications. Sometimes they are staff writers at these publications. Those stories are then published in the outlets. So this is a glimpse at some of the outlets that we've worked with last year. You see the outlet that published the story we're here to talk about today is on there, the New York Times. But this is actually just a glimpse at the over 125 news outlets throughout the world that our journalists have published their work in. Because these stories look at anything that is examining an underrepresented, underexamined, pressing systemic issue, many of the stories highlight some of the topics you see here, but often more than one. So the reporting we support can look at conflict and peace building, drug crises, health, land and property rights, and more. And many of the stories we support focus on intersections between these issues. The project we're here to talk about today is a great example of that. But I wanted you to be aware of the reporting, because one thing that's really special is any story that we support, once it's published in that news outlet, a version of the story is also published on our site. And that's true for the 1619 project as well, to ensure that any of the reporting that we support is available for free to the public, and especially for educators looking to use this work in schools. This is a screenshot of the reporting that was published just in the last week. So you see examples of stories about conflict in Sudan, published in a web outlet, Al Jazeera. You see a print outlet, National Geographic, looking at Colombia. You see an AP project, photo and print. So there's just a variety there, which I love as a teacher and someone in the education department, because there's a lot of opportunity for differentiation on different issues using the reporting. I'm starting to dig into that second half of our mission here. So not only are we supporting the journalism, but we also try to extend the reach of that reporting using education and outreach. And our mission around education, especially for K through 12 audiences, is to cultivate a more curious, informed, empathetic, and engaged public. How? By connecting students and teachers specifically with underreported global news stories, and also the journalists who cover them. Our mission is responding to studies like this one from Common Sense Media, which surveyed over 2,000 students in 2017. And something they learned that really hits to the mission statement you just looked at is, on the left here, you see that two important things. One, that 70% of students reported that watching, reading, or hearing about the news made them feel smart or knowledgeable. So we're seeing that students see the value of news. They want to feel that they know what's going on, but we also want to address what we see in the bottom part of this graph, that the news without support can lead students to feel sad, depressed, angry, afraid. So our programs address that. How can we help inform students, but also prepare them to navigate critically that news, and also to support the feelings they're feeling as they engage with that news? On the right, something we also try to address here is you see that 74% of those surveyed felt like the media is not taking into account their stories, what they care about, and reflecting their experiences. So in our programs, we also try to address this by working with students to make those local and personal connections to news stories, and also to practice the skills of telling underreported stories themselves. So these are the programs that we've put together, all in partnership with teachers like you, that we aim that we engage to approach our mission. And we've engaged all of these programs in partnership with the story we're here to talk about today, the 1619 project. This is a glimpse at what it looks like on our website. If you go to education, you can see how to engage with these programs, set up a virtual journalist visit for free to your class. You can look at workshops and contests for students to practice making local connections. And today we're going to be speaking very specifically about the 1619 education portal, which engages all of these programs. Our engagement with the project started as supporting the development of curricular resources. So resources that guide how to introduce this project to students and align elements of the project to different standards. But we have a lot of different lesson plans. This screenshot has links to some lesson plans that tie specifically to our host's mission of the year that human rights of children focus. So you see lesson plans here on the right, developed by teachers in our teacher fellowship program, on the left, developed by staff, that touch on that theme. But it was actually through the development of lesson plans that we built the relationship with the New York Times that led to us becoming the education partner of the 1619 project. This is a glimpse at two other stories where we not only supported the reporting for the story for the New York Times Magazine, but also education and outreach. Our first one was in 2016, Fractured Lands, a story that, again, like the 1619 project, took over the entire issue of the Sunday magazine to explore one theme, in this case, politics in the Middle East through the eyes of 6 individuals over the course of over a decade. So that year, you can see on the right, we not only wrote curricular resources, but worked with teachers to share those resources with their students, to learn how these resources were working in classrooms. It worked so well that the next year, we supported reporting and education and outreach for another New York Times Magazine issue focused on climate change. And there's a glimpse at that at the bottom of the screen here. That story was called Losing Earth. So in 2019, when the Times came to us with the opportunity to work on the 1619 project, they actually didn't need support with the reporting this time. So we did not fund any of the reporting, but we joined as the education partner to build on that relationship with them. We started with the curricular resource you see on the screen here and then moved into outreach. But before I go into the specifics of that, I thought maybe we could take a step back and just make sure that we know the mission of the project, the elements of it, and then have some time to explore it. So that's what we're going to start with today. Often before I engage students in the project, I'll introduce some questions to warm up and access that prior knowledge that might help build connections to the project. So something I invite everyone in the call today to start by thinking about is, when do you remember being really surprised by something you learned in a US history class or about US history? And feel free to share your responses in the chat if you would like. The second question I invite us all to consider that was part of the inspiration for this project is, when do you remember feeling really excited and inspired by something you learned about in US history, something that you thought, why didn't I know this before? This is amazing. And also, when did that happen, but at a time where you learned something about history and felt frustrated by what you were learning? Maybe something that helped you understand your experience a little better that you wish you'd known before. Feel free to share examples of that in the chat. And finally, this is a question that I'm sure we all connect to differently. How accurately do you think the US history classes that you experience reflected your experience of life in the United States if you're in this country, or your experience of what you've heard about the United States if you're not in the United States? How accurately did those classes reflect the experiences of your community? Were there moments in your classes, in your history classes, or when you learned about history where you felt very seen, like you were really a part of that moment and connected to that moment? Were there moments where you felt in US history class, I don't see myself in this moment? Oh, where is my experience reflected in the stories that I'm hearing? I'll take a look at the chat here. Colleen shared learning about Native American boarding schools, a moment that maybe led to some surprise. Kim mentions learning about the civil rights movement. Kate mentions learning about the massacre in Tulsa. I'm excited to see some of us were encouraged by our teachers to advocate for the stories we thought we should hear more of in class. Casey shares a deep dive into Holocaust history as a college student. So these questions, these moments of when we felt like new information about history we learned were inspiring us, frustrating us, but especially making us think, why didn't I know this? These are questions that inspired the journalists that initiated the 1619 project. And specifically what they began to ask themselves is, how did I first learn about the history of slavery in the United States? What did I learn, and how was that information presented? And how does that compare to my learning now? What is the lasting legacy of slavery in the US? And what information did I get growing up about the contributions of Black Americans? And where am I getting that information? These questions sort of drove the 1619 project, which was launched in 2019 to commemorate the 400th anniversary, documented here in the opening screen. So this is the opening image from the project on the New York Times Magazine's website. It reads, in August of 1619, a ship appeared on this horizon near Port Comfort, a coastal port in the English colony of Virginia. It carried more than 20 enslaved Africans who were sold to the colonists. No aspect of the country that would be formed here has been untouched by the years of slavery that follow. Here's the project making the key claim of the project that is then explored through the rest of the text in the project. On the 400th anniversary of this fateful moment, it is finally time to tell our story truthfully. And what are the stories that are being told? It's outlined directly below in this key thesis statement from the New York Times, magazine's contributors to this project. It reads, "The 1619 Project is an ongoing initiative from the New York Times Magazine that began in August 2019, the 400th anniversary of the beginning of American slavery." So that beginning is defined in that opening image, the arrival of the ship, which was called the White Lion. It aims to reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of our national narrative. And what does that mean? Well, what it looks like is an analysis of what happens and what new understanding do we have of US history, or the writers that are contributing are sharing with us as readers to analyze about US history when we center the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the center of that narrative. These questions are big, right? So of course there isn't just one person answering these questions. In the inaugural magazine issue, this question was explored through 18 essays by leading journalists and historians, some staff at the time, some not, 15 poems and short stories that were inspired by key moments in US history. So examining through our research, how do we also help connect to these moments through creative fiction? And those are very clearly stated where the essays are and where the fiction is in the essays. There were also 2 original photo essays created in the project. But that wasn't the only element, actually, when the project was published in August of 2019, there was also a print resource I want us to get a chance to look at today that includes a photo series and essays analyzing how slavery is taught. And journalists contributed to that, but also historians, specifically curator Mary Elliott from the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. Additionally, 5 of the essays were expanded upon through a podcast. And additionally, a kids section of the New York Times was created to explain the mission statement of the project, to explain what happened in August of 1619 and the questions that the project asked about the significance of that moment. And that kids section also looks at some underreported moments from US history in a few ways that we'll look at. There's some additional resources connected to the project that came out in the months following that August 6, 2019 magazine and print publication. So I want us to look at those today. And as we begin to look at those different resources, what I would love for us all in the call to do is to just notice what resources might connect to things we're teaching, might connect to questions our students have or themes that we're exploring in our schools. Maybe things that are unfamiliar to us that we might want to explore on our own. And feel free to share those ideas in the chat. All right, so here we go. We're going to start with the magazine that was published in August of 2019, which, like I said, had 18 different essays in it of different various lengths. Some of them are shorter, some of them are a little bit longer, and all of them, what they have in common is they begin with a compelling question or compelling statement that is then analyzed through historical analysis, supported by commentary from the writer and also citations of different primary source documents. Here's a glimpse at 4 of them. So on the top left, you see the compelling question, why doesn't the United States have universal health care? And the claim, the answer begins with the policies enacted after the Civil War, which is then explored by Janine Interlandi in the essay. On the right, we see an essay focused on questions around the prison system in the United States. The bottom left, questions about what is American music? And on the bottom right, a compelling question I've seen engage a lot of students. What does a traffic jam in Atlanta have to do with segregation? Quite a lot. So this gives you a glimpse into the structure of these essays, key claims that are then analyzed. And they cover a lot of different topics. So on the screen here are the other topics that you can find an essay about in the project. Take a look and note which ones might you want to explore today or following this presentation to learn a little bit more about the consequences of slavery and contributions of Black Americans, stories that might have been underreported. There are essays on capitalism, banking practices, essays on the sugar trade, the establishment of cities. Ones I think we haven't mentioned are wealth, the accumulation of wealth. I'm just going to take a look in the chat and see. And as some of us are sharing some additional resources in the chat. If you go to the Times, yes, there are some really interesting stories that came after the initial magazine publication examining different textbooks, which could be an exciting resource for your colleagues and students. One thing I wanted to highlight in the project is that these essays are rich with primary source documents and photo resources that can also help engage students in these analyses. One thing the Pulitzer Center created for professional development, and I'm excited to share with you today, is this index that I'm going to put in the chat right now of images from the project. And so one activity I've tried with students and with teachers is even a sort of gallery walk of the images from the project, noticing what elements compel my attention or draw in my attention. And then once I find a photo that's really drawing me in, especially once I've thought about the mission of the project to explore US history with that lens of centering the experience of Black Americans and what new understandings we might have about the present by centering those stories, you can jump down to the bottom of this document and see where the photos came from. So say, if I'm particularly drawn, maybe students might be familiar with this image, which is a more recent image. This is on page 10. I can scroll to the bottom of the document and find which essay includes that. So that looks like that image comes from the first essay in the project, The Idea of America by Nicole Hannah-Jones. All right. So feel free to explore there. I'm going to keep going here, but I'm excited to see if there's an image that you find particularly compelling. Please let us know in the chat which one it is. Maybe we could look at it together and examine how it might engage our students. All right. So the next thing I wanted us to be aware of, especially if we're in classrooms where we might want to engage students in many different ways, through visuals, through text, but also through audio, the podcast takes a close look at 4 of the essays that I just shared with you. The first is a closer look at the Idea of America essay from Nicole Hannah-Jones. The second focuses on the capitalism essay by Matthew Desmond. The third looks at the music essay by Wesley Morris. And then the last 2 episodes, the fourth looks at the healthcare essays by Linda Villarosa and Janine Interlandi. And the fifth is a 2-part essay inspired by the essay Sugar by Khalil Gibran Muhammad that centers the story of a family right now navigating the struggles they're dealing with to keep the land that they've had for multiple generations, the farming land. And it looks into why is that family having that challenge right now by exploring content from the sugar essay and additional research. One thing I love about the podcast is that you can, on the New York Times podcast website for the podcast, you can also look at the text and citations for all of the audio as students are listening. This is a glimpse at the creative works that are embedded within the project. They're tied to different moments in history, as you can see here. But to give us a glimpse at one of these, what I'd love to do is have us listen to the author read this poem. And then as an activity, once we've finished listening, add to the chat what underreported moment from US history that examines the consequences of slavery, contributions of Black Americans both, do you think this poem is exploring? All right, and this is by Rita Dove. Oops, and just let me know if you can't hear this.
Youth Sunday. This morning's already good. Summer's cooling, Addie chattering like a magpie, but today we are leading the congregation. Ain't that a fine thing? All in white, like angels, they'll be sighing when we appear at the pulpit and proclaim, "Open your hymnals." Addie, What's the page number again? Never mind. It'll be posted, I think. I hope. Hold still, Carol, or else this sash will never sit right. There. Now you do mine. Almost 11. I'm ready. My, don't we look? What's the word the Reverend used in last Sunday's sermon? Oh, I got it. Ethereal.
Just taking a look in the chat to see, are any of us connecting to this, this poem and potentially the moment in history that's being explored here? Yes, Matthew, we're gonna have to come, we'll come back to that, that creative work. That is a blackout poem from one of the creative works, yes. Michelle, yes, is highlighting, this is the September 15th, 1963 bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. So you see the creative works also are accompanied by original artwork and an explanation of that moment if students are unfamiliar with it. But one thing I've loved talking about with students is why the 1619 project might include creative works as a part of its exploration. What additional understanding do we have about this history and these moments in history and how they relate to the present when they're explored through fiction and through poetry, which can be an interesting exploration with your students. This is a glimpse at the broadsheet that I mentioned, which was published the same week as that magazine article. And it has two essays, the one from Nikita Stewart that I see some of us talking about in the chat, where Nikita is telling her own family story, excuse me, a story about one of her own family members and comparing that story to some of her research on how slavery is taught using different textbooks. But since I know we're working with a lot of grade levels here, I also wanted to familiarize us with the broadsheet, which is made up of images of objects from the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture, all selected by curator Mary Elliott and narrated to outline some underrepresented moments through history and how they are represented in these objects, or underrepresented understandings. So let's take a look at one of them, and feel free to share in the chat any of your responses to the questions you see here that I know I've used to share with students. First, what do you see in the image? Noticing details before we are making guesses about what story this image is telling us about history, trying to gather all the detailed information we can. A basket, shares Kim, maybe made with grasses, Kate guesses. Matthew notices a piece of string or rope. And now we're also starting to ask ourselves some questions. Terrell wonders, was it hand woven? I saw Karen was wondering, is this from an African country? As students and all of us are beginning to ask ourselves these questions, we can return to the project's mission. What is this image telling us about the consequences of slavery, the contributions of Black Americans, about our present? And as they move into that discussion, we can look at the caption from the curator to learn a little bit more about it. Casey, great question. How long would it take to make this? And what was it used for? Michelle wonders, maybe cotton. Let's take a look. According to the curators here, the historians who identified this object, they write that this was a basket. Let me just get to this part here. I'll go ahead and read this. Enslaved Black people came from regions and ethnic groups throughout Africa. Though they came empty-handed, they carried with them memories of loved ones and communities, moral values, intellectual insight, artistic talents, and cultural practices, religious belief, and skills. In their new environment, they relied on these memories to create new practices infused with old ones, starting to give us the context for this object. In the Low Country region of the Carolinas and Georgia, planters specifically requested skilled enslaved people from a region stretching from Senegal to Liberia who were familiar with the conditions ideal for growing rice. Starting to get a clue here about what this image is sharing with us. Charleston quickly became the busiest port for people shipped from West Africa. The coiled or woven baskets used to separate rice grains from husks during harvest were a form of artistry and technology brought from Africa to the colonies. Although the baskets were utilitarian, they also served as a source of artistic pride and a way to stay connected to the culture and memory of the homeland. So this is one of many objects that in this broadsheet that could engage your students. I know often what I love to do with this object is to talk to students about what might be some of the present day connections to what we're learning from this object, about the ways that skill, talent were brought to this country and used utilized in this country. Where do we see evidence of that today? What might be the lasting impact of that? Could be some questions that guide students' research. For those of us working with younger students or students who might want to engage with a shorter resource, this is the resource for children published by the New York Times. Includes 3 components: a list of key numbers that represent underrepresented stories throughout history, centering the experiences of Black Americans. There is a section called 4 Myths about slavery, and also an interview with a historian. It includes this introduction to the project written for children. That again, I will share this resource with everyone if you'd like to use this. It could be helpful in explaining to younger audiences the mission of the project. And here's a quick glimpse at ways that I've seen teachers use this resource. Very simply, it could act as a scavenger hunt resource for students to learn about these key numbers. So let's try that ourselves. We see one of the numbers represented in the resource is 12.5. So I wonder, let me know in the chat, is it 1, 2, or 3? Which one of these true moments in history is represented by the number 1.5? Is it the first one? The rough percentage of the 55 American revolutionaries who met in 1781 to finalize the Constitution, who also owned enslaved people. If you think that was 12.5%, put a 1 in the chat. Is it the estimated number of people of African descent in millions who were forcibly transported from their homelands to plantations? If that's the number 12.5 in millions, put the number 2 in the chat. Or is it number 3, the age of the girl Red Doshi when she was brought to the United States? She is believed to have been the last survivor of the slave trade. She died in 1937. Is it number 3? I'm seeing lots of great guesses in the chat. What's really exciting is all 3 of these facts are in the document. So these are all 3 explored. And this is actually the number of people of African descent in millions forcibly transported. So that's what the number 12.5 represents. So what was the other numbers? You should check out this resource to get a glimpse. So we're looking at the consequences of slavery in this trivia here. We also see trivia that highlights underrepresented moments of resistance and resilience throughout history. Well, just like the previous one did as well. So here's another quick quiz question. Which of these years represent this fact about US history? Which of these was the year that Elizabeth Freeman, an enslaved woman in Massachusetts, better known as Mum Bet, sued for her freedom and won? Was it A, 1781, B, 1793, or C, 1836? Okay, I'm seeing all of us contributing, which is awesome. So all of us succeed in giving it a shot here. The answer in this case is A, 1781. So what key thing happened in 1793 or 1836? Check out this resource to find out. It's linked in the chat. Yes, and the sources for these numbers are listed in or credited in the resource. Yes. Casey, great question. The last element that I wanted us to be aware of is there is a short film summary of the project that is on, the link is here. You just click on watch the film, and this will introduce a little bit about the background for the project. I'm going to skip this today, but definitely recommend it if you're looking to hear directly from contributors a little bit about their experience developing the project. 2 exciting resources that came out this week are the new books connected to the project. So the first is the 1619 Project, a New Origin Story book, which includes 8 new essays and then extensions of many of the essays within the project. There are also additional contributions to the literary timeline and new images. Excellent. Great to see that, Christina. There's also the children's book, Born on the Water. And I'm sharing a summary of the book here. It takes the Idea of America essay by Nicole Hannah-Jones as inspiration in telling the story of a young Black girl who struggles to complete a school assignment that asks her to locate her ancestral home on a map. And when that happens, her grandmother begins telling her the story of their family's ancestral origin by starting in West Central Africa. The text is broken up into these different chapters that you see below. So and also includes really beautiful illustrations. So those are all the resources in the project. I'm curious, from what you've seen so far today, will you share in the chat the number of the resource that you're interested in looking at in more detail after today's session? Maybe one you haven't gotten to look at before. Ashley's sharing the photography. Michael's going for all of it. Great. Hopefully I can share some resources that help. Kate mentions the broadsheet. Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Well, as you're beginning to explore these resources, there are some things that can support your engagement. So let me briefly go through those so that we can then get to questions. We'll come back to that. So this is the link to a new website that just launched this week. That is capturing some of the resources and ideas that are out there now from the Pulitzer Center and other teams of educators on ways to use the project in classrooms. And I've put that website in the chat. What's there for us to explore? The first thing is if you want to hear directly from contributors, there are a lot of links to webinars where you can hear contributors speak about their essays. Also, if you want to begin diving into the text, we have reading guides that offer discussion questions, vocabulary. They point to maybe some description of reading level, and that exists for the essays, for the podcast. And there's also a link in those reading guides to full PDFs for those of us who don't have access to the magazine yet. Some of what I was sharing earlier. There's also a reading guide for both of the books. Unfortunately, we don't have PDFs available for the books, but if you go to the 1619 books website, let me go ahead and pull that up right here. There is a link, a place where those of us who are working in education can let Penguin Random House know that we're looking for books, and there might be a way for you to get books at a discount there. But if you were to check those out, you'll see we do have a reading guide there that is also designed for administrators, for those of you who want to share with administrators a little bit about what we've learned from educators has been some of the unique advantages that the 1619 project can bring to classrooms. It also, like our reading guides, includes, let me just show you this, key vocabulary, some guiding questions, some ideas for activities and themes, and also just a little direction about where to find these in the books. We have full lesson plans for a few of the resources you've looked at. You see on the screen here, and these are all links to those lesson plans. And each of those will include everything from a warm-up to extension activities. Also some graphic organizers to help students track details. Few more of those full lesson plans. We also have some suggested activities inspired by the different essays. And I just wanted you to get a glimpse at what those have looked like in classrooms so far. So you see at the top right, a student inspired by the Blackout poem by Reginald Dwayne Betts examining the Fugitive Slave Act by blocking out text to reveal some text within that law that might speak to an underreported voice, underrepresented voice, new understanding of that law. These students were inspired by that poem and did the same thing, but using one of the essays from the project. Here, students were inspired by the many essays that highlight contributions by Black Americans to do their own research and present their own projects telling stories that might not have otherwise been told about contributions by Black Americans. Here's an example of students collecting details they were less familiar with throughout history and comparing those details to what they remembered learning in other classes. And what we've learned in watching teachers start to engage with these resources is that teachers and students continue to be the most creative colleagues and contributors that we can be working with. And so we've begun working with communities throughout the US and world to try documenting some of what students and teachers are finding as helpful connections to the text, and then sharing those on the website that I showed you earlier. So here are examples of student work inspired by the project, visual art that is elevating themes from essays explored by students on the left, inspired by the idea of America, on the right, inspired by mass incarceration. We've seen students create their own reporting resources. On the right here is a screenshot of a class in Chicago that created their own magazine examining the same topics from the project in their own city and doing their own research and sharing with their families and communities. On the left, students in DC did a similar thing, but through a public event. This was right before the pandemic, where families were invited to engage with quotes from the project, poems, and work with students on doing some analysis. We launched this year, building on what we've been learning from teachers, a network where educators and administrators were invited to apply for an opportunity to work together and with their students to continue looking at how these many resources can support different curricular standards. And we are now nearing the end of our first year of that network, and I can actually show you some of what's been created today. These are the goals of our network: to explore these resources and see how they connect to our standards, and then to create standards aligned lesson plans and implement them to examine with our students' feedback how they support student learning. We have this year members in 22, I think over 20 states. We have 41 teams this year made up of educators and administrators. Maybe you see your state on here. And if you don't, hopefully you'll apply next year if you're interested. And we've just begun to publish some of the units created by our network members. More will be coming in February. These are three I wanted to briefly highlight. On the left, the Community Education Project is based in Florida. It's a program that is for young adults and adults of all ages in the prison system in Florida, in a partnership with a university there. And there, the participants are exploring historiography. So how does the project inspire the program participants to conduct their own research about the history of the land where the prison is on and the territory around, or the land around the prison? In the center here is a lesson created by a school in California where students do a deep dive into the healthcare essay, and then a complete DBQ, which is an analysis for students to use data and details from text to support their own arguments, in this case focused on healthcare. This lesson on the far right centers standards for elementary and middle school students, where they're learning about the Revolutionary War and using different texts from within the essays to examine the stories of Black Americans who were in their experiences of the Revolutionary War, looking at the essays for those stories, but then using that as inspiration to conduct their own research. These are all on our website now. So if you want to check out this team, they're from the Michigan area, from a few different cities in Michigan. If you want to see their lessons, they are fully available to you, including full unit plans. And we cannot wait for all of the essays to be published in February, or not the essays, the units. They're also going to be part of a public conference that you're all welcome to join to learn more about those units. We've also begun to collect feedback on how the books have been used in classrooms. So there's a blog linked here where you can hear from some teachers who've begun using the books in their classrooms. At the bottom, there is a link to some curricular resources where you can see what different teachers are trying, some really beautiful projects inspired by both of the 1619 books. So that's what I prepared to share. I want to leave some time for questions and exploring, but what I think I'll close this presentee part with is just encouragement to start your engagement with this project by taking a look at the resources, noting what is popping for you, building on your own wisdom and expertise to make those connections to your standards and to the themes that you're teaching in your classes, and then to consider what aspects of the project might best engage your students, and also what scaffolds and supports you might want to provide for teachers you work with, for students you work with, to prepare them to engage with the content, but also to engage with the emotions that might come up as they engage with these resources, many of which might be presenting stories that students might connect to personally and need support processing. So we'd love to collaborate with all of you to learn a little bit, to hear what ideas you might have. Let me go ahead and pause here for some questions. So you can go ahead and share those in the chat or using the Q&A function. For those of you who are sort of in a place where you want to explore, another thing I wanted to offer is this link, where for those of you who would like to begin exploring, this is a document with, let's do this, all of the resources from the project outside of the books. So if you want direct links, you can get there, and you're welcome to begin exploring and noting maybe what texts or images are standing out to you. If you want to see some other teachers who've tried this activity, what stood out to them, here is a glimpse in the slideshow of what they were drawn to. All right, I'll turn it over to you, Kim, for any questions that we have.
Yeah, so we do have one in the Q&A that I think I know the answer to, but I'm not sure. So if you want to address that. And I think also just the fact that you mentioned at the beginning about how students feel smarter when they know about the news, but how they can also feel depressed or sad and such. And you made the comment that I think is so important to all of this, that when it's supported, right, that we have to support what our students are hearing and seeing and help them through it. And that if they're looking at it, you know, with fact-based, good information like what you've provided here, it's going to help them so much more. And you mentioned at the end how students might react to this emotionally, as we all should. You know, but I think that again, if we approach it in these, using these materials and being very, you know, empathetic as well, it's going to be great. And lots of comments about how great these resources are. So thank you.
Wonderful. I'm glad to hear it. Any other question? Shall I address the question? The slides are now in the chat. Any other questions come through the Q&A? I'm seeing Chelsea's question here about questions around the representation of Indigenous communities in these resources. So that has actually been a really, I'm excited for the units to come out because some of our network partners have also been interested in that. And so students are conducting that inquiry inspired by the project. So I can't speak to this exact question, but I would encourage you to consider, is that a question that the project can inspire your students to then do further research? There's also a little bit more about the experience of Indigenous people in some of the time periods that are explored in the project in the book. So if you're able to grab the book, you'll see it there. Any other questions? And I'm going to pull up a version of that document that you should be able to access while we're listening for questions.
And Fareed, if there are any issues with any documents not sharing, we can always share them by email afterwards.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, that would be great. So I'll be sure to share everything with you afterwards as well. I do want to just pull this up though while I'm here. So let me see if I can grab it for you.
Absolutely.
Any other questions or any connections that you noticed, Kim, to some of the other work that, oh, I see a question from Colleen.
Yeah.
Is there a specific lesson you could suggest that would be a good way to connect with this history to a Holocaust course? Let me see. I'm going to pull up the curricular resources here. Thank you, Terrell. Yes, I know there's a lot to explore there. I'm really excited to hear from you all on as you look at the resources where you're seeing those connections. I feel like you'll come up with a better idea than I have. So the first resource I would suggest is the reading guide, so that you can get a glimpse of some of the themes from the different essays, which I believe will connect to some of the essays when you're exploring the political context in the time of the Holocaust, not only the responses, basically looking at the responses throughout the world to that moment as well. And also there have been another very interesting article to look at that is not directly connected to the project, but came out just after, is a look from Nicole Hannah-Jones, considering research into reparations. And there are some citations in that article that look at how Germany responded after the Holocaust. So that could be an interesting connection as well. That's on the Times website. All right. Any other questions?
Well, Fareed, we can't thank you enough. This has been fabulous. So many compliments in the chat box. Great information. And I think everybody is excited to delve into it and use it in their classroom. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I'm so excited for the rest of the sessions as part of this series. If you find from this presentation or any of the presentations in the future that content is coming to mind where you'd love to have a journalist come to your classroom and speak about that content, I'm going to put my email in the chat and I hope you'll reach out. From the topics I hear we'll be exploring in the future sessions, and also for this topic, we have a lot of journalists who would love to come and talk to your students about their experience doing that reporting.
Thank you so much. And that link that you last posted with all the files, I was able to open, but if anybody isn't, please email me, kim@eihr.org, and we can get that sent to you. I also want to remind you to register for our December 5th webinar with the folks from Nadia's initiative to discuss the Yazidis and The Last Girl, her book. Fareed, again, thank you so much for joining us. This has been such a pleasure. And yes, Christina, I just provided that link, but I'll put it in again in case you missed it.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you all.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank you. You too. Have a great rest of the weekend.
You too. Bye, everyone.